Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Nobody in my family ever talked about the dead things. That was just how we operated, I guess. I grew up in a small house in rural Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and nothing exciting ever happened except for church potlucks and high school football games. My brother Elliot was 4 years older than me, which meant by the time I started kindergarten in 1994, he was already this mysterious figure who spent most of his time in his room or wandering the woods behind our property. Our parents worked long hours at the manufacturing plant 2 towns over, so Elliot and I were often alone together after school. He was quiet, the kind of quiet that adults always mistook for politeness or shyness. Teachers loved him. Neighbors called him such a nice young man. But even as a little girl, something about the way he watched things made me uncomfortable, though I never had the words to explain why. The first pet that died was my hamster, Peanut. I was 7 years old and had only had him for 3 weeks when I found him stiff in his cage one morning. His tiny body contorted in a way that seemed wrong even to my childish eyes. My mother said he probably had a heart attack, that hamsters were fragile creatures. Elliot stood in my doorway while I cried, his face completely blank, and when our mom left the room, he told me he could help me bury Peanut in the backyard. I remember how carefully he handled the small body, how he seemed almost fascinated by the weight of it in his palm. 2 months later, our neighbor's cat went missing, and then it was the Thornton family's dog down the street. People blamed coyotes. Elliot never said anything about any of it, but I noticed he started spending more time in those woods, coming home with dirt under his fingernails and scratches on his forearms that he claimed came from thorny bushes. By the time I reached middle school, I had learned to keep a mental catalog of strange coincidences. Billy Ashworth broke his arm falling off his bike on a route Elliot had suggested as a shortcut. Megan Pryor got food poisoning at a birthday party where Elliot had helped serve cake. A boy named Danny Schultz, who had once made fun of Elliot's secondhand clothes, somehow ended up with a severe allergic reaction during lunch period, even though the school nurse swore there were no peanuts in anything he ate. Each incident had a perfectly reasonable explanation on its own. Accidents happen to kids all the time, my mother would say. But I started noticing how Elliot would ask about these people in the days before something happened to them. Casual questions about their schedules, their habits, what they liked to eat. And afterward, he never seemed surprised. He would just nod slowly when our parents discussed the news at dinner, his fork moving methodically across his plate, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the kitchen window. The summer I turned 14, old Mr. Callahan, who lived at the end of our road, fell down his basement stairs and broke his hip. He died 3 weeks later from complications, and the whole town showed up to his funeral. I remember standing in the back of the church watching Elliot in the front pew with our parents, his head bowed in what everyone probably assumed was grief or respect. But I had seen him coming out of Mr. Callahan's tool shed 2 days before the fall. When I asked him what he was doing there, he just smiled and said he was returning a wrench our dad had borrowed. The thing is, I knew for a fact our dad never borrowed anything from Mr. Callahan, because the two of them had been in some petty argument about property lines for years. I never told anyone about that. I was 14 and part of me still wanted to believe my brother was just weird, not dangerous. That was the lie I told myself for a very long time. Elliot moved out when he turned 18. Right after graduating high school with honors. He got a job at some warehouse a few hours away, and our parents acted like he had gone off to conquer the world. I was secretly relieved when he left. The house felt lighter, if that makes any sense. No more finding dead birds on the back porch that he claimed the cat must have brought in, even though we did not have a cat. No more waking up at 2 in the morning to the sound of the back door closing and wondering where he had been. I threw myself into school, made friends, went to college in Pennsylvania, and built a life that had nothing to do with that little house in Ohio. Elliot and I exchanged maybe 3 phone calls a year, always on holidays, always brief. He sounded normal enough. He told me about jobs, apartments, a girlfriend once. I convinced myself that maybe I had imagined all those childhood suspicions, that maybe I had just been a paranoid kid with an overactive imagination looking for patterns that were not there. Our dad passed away from a heart attack in 2015, and our mom followed him 2 years later after a long fight with cancer. I was the one who handled most of the arrangements because Elliot said he could not get time off work for the funerals. He showed up to our mother's burial for exactly 40 minutes, stood at the edge of the group with sunglasses on even though it was overcast, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. After the estate was settled, the house sat empty for years. I kept paying the property taxes because I could not bring myself to sell it, but I never went back. Then, this past October, I got a letter from the county saying there were code violations that needed to be addressed, something about the roof and overgrown vegetation. I had no choice but to drive out there and assess the damage myself. I wish I had just hired someone to deal with it. I wish I had never stepped foot in that house again. The drive took almost 5 hours, and I arrived just as the sun was starting to set. The house looked smaller than I remembered, sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Paint peeling off the siding in long strips, gutters hanging loose, the front porch steps rotted through in places. I let myself in with the old key that still hung on my keychain after all these years, and the smell hit me immediately. Mildew, dust, and something else underneath it all. Something faintly metallic that I could not identify. The furniture was still there, covered in white sheets like ghosts frozen mid-conversation. I walked through the living room, the kitchen, my parents' old bedroom. Everything was exactly as they had left it, preserved in a thick layer of grime. But when I climbed the stairs to the second floor and pushed open the door to Elliot's room, I found something I was not expecting. The room had been cleared out completely, except for a single cardboard box sitting in the middle of the floor. It was not dusty like everything else. Someone had been here recently. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in my car and drive away, to call a realtor and let them handle everything remotely. But I could not stop myself from opening that box. Inside, there were notebooks. Dozens of them, the cheap composition kind with the black and white marbled covers. And underneath the notebooks, there were drawings. I pulled out the first one and my breath caught in my throat. It was a detailed sketch of a cat, anatomically precise. But the cat was cut open, its organs labeled in neat handwriting. There were notes in the margins about which incisions caused the most blood loss, which organs could be removed while the animal was still alive. I flipped through more pages and found dogs, birds, squirrels, all documented the same way. Dates were written at the top of each page. The earliest one I found was from 1991, when Elliot would have been only 9 years old. The notebooks were worse. They were organized by year, each one filled with Elliot's handwriting in blue ink that had faded to gray over time. He had documented everything: names, addresses, daily routines, weaknesses. There were pages dedicated to specific people, our neighbors, classmates, even our own parents. He had noted what time our dad left for work, what medications our mom took, which days I had piano lessons. One entry described in clinical detail how he had loosened the bolts on Mr. Callahan's basement railing, calculating the angle of the fall and the likelihood of serious injury, based on the old man's weight and bone density. Another section chronicled his experiments in the woods, complete with maps showing where he had buried the remains. There was a whole notebook dedicated to something he called reaction studies, where he observed how people behaved when they were afraid or in pain. He had been watching all of us, studying us like specimens, and none of us ever knew. I was still sitting on the floor of his room, surrounded by evidence of my brother's secret life, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. My heart nearly stopped. Through the grimy window, I could see a dark sedan parking behind my car, and a man in a gray suit stepping out. For one terrible moment, I thought it was Elliot, that he had somehow known I would be here. But the man who knocked on the front door identified himself as Detective Paul Harmon from the state police. He was looking for information about my brother. A young woman had gone missing from a town about 60 miles from here. a 23-year-old named Brittany Lowe, who had vanished from her apartment 3 weeks ago without a trace. Elliot's name had come up during the investigation. They had found his fingerprints on her mailbox, and a neighbor had seen someone matching his description watching her building on multiple occasions in the weeks before she disappeared. The detective asked me when I had last spoken to my brother, and I realized I could not remember. It had been at least 2 years, maybe longer. I showed Detective Harmon everything I had found. He called in a forensic team that same night, and they spent hours photographing the notebooks, bagging the drawings, searching the woods behind the house with flashlights and cadaver dogs. They found bones out there, animal bones mostly, but also some fragments that would need further testing. The detective sat with me in the kitchen while his team worked, asking me questions about our childhood, about Elliot's behavior, about the accidents I had always suspected but never reported. I told him everything, every strange coincidence, every uneasy feeling, every time I had looked at my brother and seen something hollow behind his eyes. When I finished, Detective Harmon was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me that Brittany Lowe was not the first. There had been other disappearances over the years in towns where Elliot had lived or worked, young women who had vanished without explanation. The police had never been able to connect them until now, until his fingerprints showed up on that mailbox, and a pattern finally emerged from the chaos. I gave the detective my contact information and agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. Before he left, he asked me one more question that has haunted me ever since. He wanted to know if Elliot had ever shown any particular interest in me, if he had ever made me feel unsafe. I thought about all those years growing up in that house, the way Elliot would sometimes stand in my doorway at night without saying anything, the detailed notes about my piano schedule in his notebooks, and I realized something that made my entire body go cold. In all those pages, all those observations about neighbors and classmates and strangers, there was one person he had documented more thoroughly than anyone else. Me. My habits, my friends, my fears, the route I took to school, the window I always left cracked open at night because I liked the fresh air. The last entry about me was dated just 6 months ago, long after I had moved away, long after I thought I had escaped. He had written my current address in Pennsylvania, the name of the coffee shop where I stop every morning, and a single sentence at the bottom of the page. She always knew. She will have to be dealt with eventually. That was 3 months ago. I do not live in Pennsylvania anymore. I sold my apartment, quit my job, and moved to a different state where I am staying with a friend whose address is not connected to my name in any way. I changed my phone number, deleted all my social media accounts, and bought a handgun that I keep in my nightstand drawer. Detective Harmon calls me every few weeks to update me on the investigation, but there is not much to report. Elliot has vanished. His last known apartment was cleared out, his bank accounts emptied, his car abandoned in a parking lot near the West Virginia border. They found Brittany Lowe's body in November, buried in a shallow grave about 20 miles from where she lived. The forensic evidence matched what the police found in those woods behind our childhood home. There is now a warrant out for my brother's arrest on multiple counts of murder, but nobody knows where he is. He could be anywhere. He could be watching someone else right now, taking notes, learning their routines, waiting for the right moment. I am sharing this because I need people to understand something. The monsters we fear are not hiding under our beds or lurking in abandoned buildings. They sit across from us at dinner tables. They attend our birthday parties and our funerals. They smile at us and ask about our day, and nobody ever suspects because they have spent their whole lives learning how to seem normal. If you have a feeling about someone, a persistent unease that you cannot explain, do not ignore it. Do not convince yourself that you are being paranoid or unfair. I spent my entire childhood watching my brother hurt things and people, and I never said a word because I wanted to believe I was wrong. I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. Elliot is still out there somewhere, and I know he has not forgotten about me. Every time I hear a noise at night, every time I notice a car parked too long on my street, every time I feel like someone is watching me, I wonder if today is the day he finally comes to finish what he started. I do not know how this story ends, I just know that I refuse to be another name in one of his notebooks. Sometimes I think about how close I came to dying on a random Wednesday in October of 2017, and it still makes my chest tight. My sister had just given birth to her first baby in Phoenix, and since I lived in Albuquerque at the time, I decided to make the 6-hour drive instead of dealing with flight delays and rental cars. I had turned 34 that spring, finally stable in my nursing career after years of bouncing between hospitals, and the road trip felt like a good chance to decompress before meeting my nephew. I left work around 7 in the evening, figuring I could drive through the night and arrive by early morning. My Subaru Outback had just passed inspection. I had a full tank of gas, a podcast queue loaded up, and a large coffee from the hospital cafeteria. Everything felt normal. Everything felt safe. I remember thinking how much I loved night driving on empty highways, the way the world shrinks down to just your headlights and the white lines disappearing beneath your wheels. Around midnight, I was somewhere between Socorro and Truth or Consequences on Interstate 25, surrounded by absolute darkness. New Mexico desert at night is a different kind of lonely. No streetlights, no houses, just the occasional pair of headlights passing in the opposite direction. I had been driving for nearly 5 hours and my bladder was protesting. Plus, I wanted to stretch my legs and grab another coffee or an energy drink. When I saw the glow of a gas station sign rising up from the flatness ahead, I felt relieved. It was one of those small, independent stations, not a big chain with harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly yellow and washed out. There were only 2 other cars in the parking lot, a beat-up pickup truck near the air pump, and a dark sedan parked at an odd angle near the side of the building. I pulled up to a pump closest to the store entrance, not really thinking about positioning, just eager to use the restroom. The store inside was small and cramped, shelves packed too tightly together with that random assortment you find at rural gas stations. Motor oil next to bags of chips, dusty stuffed animals hanging from a rack near the register. An older woman sat behind the counter, maybe in her 60s, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a paperback novel open in front of her. She barely looked up when I asked for the restroom key, just pointed toward a door at the back with a wooden paddle attached to a set of keys. The bathroom was exactly what you would expect. Flickering light, cracked mirror, that specific industrial soap smell mixed with something vaguely sour. I did my business quickly, washed my hands and avoided looking too closely at anything. When I came back out, I grabbed an energy drink from the cooler and a pack of peanut butter crackers, paid with my card, and exchanged maybe 3 words with the woman at the register. She seemed tired, disinterested, and I did not blame her for working the graveyard shift in the middle of nowhere. I pushed through the glass door back into the night air, which had gotten colder while I was inside. That high desert chill cuts right through you once the sun goes down, and I remember pulling my jacket tighter as I walked toward my car. That is when I noticed him. A man was standing near the back of my Subaru, crouched down slightly like he was examining something. He was average height, maybe late 40s, wearing a denim jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. Nothing about him screamed danger. He looked like any guy you might see at a hardware store on a Saturday morning. When he saw me approaching, he straightened up and smiled. It was a friendly smile, the kind that crinkles the eyes, and he raised one hand in a little wave. My first instinct was not fear, but mild confusion. I thought maybe he had accidentally bumped my car or was checking if he knew me from somewhere. People are friendly in small towns, and this felt like that kind of place. "Hey there," he said, his voice casual and warm. "I noticed you got a flat tire on your back passenger side. Looks pretty bad, actually. You probably did not even feel it go, but you definitely should not be driving on that." He gestured toward the rear of my car with a concerned expression. I blinked at him, surprised, and walked around to look. In the dim light from the station, the tire did look a little low, but nothing dramatic. I had checked my tires before leaving Albuquerque. It was something my dad drilled into me years ago, and they had all been fine. I said something like, "Oh really? It looks okay to me," He shook his head slowly, the way someone does when they are trying to be patient with you. Trust me, I have been working on cars my whole life. That thing is going to blow out on you within 10 miles, guaranteed. You do not want to be stranded out here in the middle of the night. I got a jack in my truck. I can change it for you real quick. He pointed toward the beat-up pickup I had noticed earlier. Something in my gut tightened. It was not a dramatic alarm bell, just a quiet discomfort that I could not name. Here was this seemingly helpful stranger offering to fix a problem I did not know I had, and logically, I should have been grateful. But there was something about the way he had positioned himself, the way he seemed too eager, too insistent. I noticed his eyes kept flicking toward the dark sedan parked on the side of the building, like he was checking something. And the more I looked at my tire, the more it seemed fine. Maybe slightly lower than the others, but nothing that would cause a blowout. I thought about all the true crime podcasts I had listened to on long drives. All the stories about women who ignored their instincts because they did not want to seem rude or paranoid. My mother always told me that politeness had gotten more women killed than anything else. I made a decision in that moment that probably saved my life. "You know what? I really appreciate the offer," I said, keeping my voice light and friendly even though my heart was starting to beat faster. "But my brother-in-law is a mechanic, and he is meeting me in about 20 minutes just up the road. He can take a look at it if there is a problem." It was a complete lie. My brother-in-law sold insurance and could barely change a light bulb, but it came out smoothly, like I had rehearsed it. The man's expression shifted just for a second. His smile stayed in place, but something behind his eyes changed. It was like watching a mask slip and then get readjusted so quickly you almost convince yourself you imagined it. 20 minutes, huh? That is a long way to drive on a bad tire. You could have a blowout, roll your car. I have seen it happen. His voice had an edge now, a hint of frustration underneath the helpful tone. He took a step toward me, and I instinctively stepped back toward my driver's side door. "I really think you should let me take a look. It will only take a few minutes." I shook my head and pulled my keys from my jacket pocket, pressing the unlock button even though the doors were already unlocked. I just wanted him to hear the beep, to know I was ready to leave. "I will be fine, but thank you so much for the concern. Have a good night." I moved quickly around to the driver's side, not quite running but not walking casually either. As I opened the door, I glanced back at him one more time. He was standing exactly where I had left him, watching me with an expression I still cannot fully describe. It was not angry, not exactly. It was more like disappointment mixed with something calculating, like a predator watching prey slip away and already thinking about the next opportunity. I got into my car, locked the doors immediately and started the engine. My hands were steady, but inside I was trembling. I pulled out of that parking lot faster than I should have, gravel spraying behind me as I turned back onto the interstate. In my rearview mirror, I saw him still standing there under the fluorescent lights, getting smaller and smaller until the darkness swallowed him completely. I drove for about 45 minutes without stopping, my eyes constantly checking the mirrors for any headlights that might be following me. Every time a car appeared behind me, my heart would race until it either passed or turned off onto another road. The tire seemed fine. No wobbling, no strange sounds, nothing that indicated any problem at all. I started to second-guess myself, wondering if I had been paranoid, if that man really was just a helpful stranger and I had been rude for no reason. But then I would remember that look in his eyes, the way his demeanor changed when I declined his help, and I knew I had made the right call. When I finally reached Las Cruces around 1:30 in the morning, I pulled into a well-lit truck stop that was busy with travelers and long-haul drivers. I parked under a bright light near the entrance and just sat there for a few minutes, letting my breathing slow down. I thought about calling my sister, but I did not want to worry her when she had just given birth. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? A man offered to help me with my tire and I said no. I checked into a motel in Las Cruces instead of continuing to Phoenix. I was too shaken to keep driving, and the exhaustion had caught up with me in a way that felt dangerous. The room was basic but clean, and I triple-checked the lock on the door before collapsing onto the bed fully clothed. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by dreams I cannot remember but that left me waking up with my heart pounding. When morning finally came, pale light filtering through the cheap curtains, I felt ridiculous. In the daylight, the whole encounter seemed less sinister. I convinced myself that I had overreacted, that he was probably just some lonely guy who wanted to feel useful, and I had been rude to him for no real reason. I took a shower, grabbed breakfast at a diner attached to the motel, and checked my phone while I ate. That is when I saw the news alert that changed everything. A man had been arrested at a gas station on Interstate 25, just south of Socorro. The article said he was wanted in connection with the disappearances of at least 4 women over the past 3 years, all of them traveling alone on remote highways in New Mexico and Arizona. His method was always the same. He would puncture their tires while they were inside paying or using the restroom, then approach them as a helpful stranger, offering to fix the problem. The women who accepted his help were never seen alive again. Police had found remains on a property he owned about 60 miles from the interstate, buried in shallow graves in the desert. His name was printed in the article, but I do not remember it now. My brain just refused to hold on to it. What I do remember is the photo they included. It was a mugshot, his face lit by harsh institutional lighting, and even though he was not smiling anymore, I recognized him instantly. The denim jacket, the shape of his jaw, the way his eyes looked flat and empty without that friendly mask he wore. It was him. It was the man from the gas station. I dropped my phone onto the table and had to grip the edge to keep myself upright. The waitress asked if I was okay, and I could not even answer her. I just sat there, staring at nothing, trying to process the fact that I had been standing 3 feet away from a serial killer less than 12 hours ago. He had touched my car. He had looked me in the eyes and smiled. The article said he was arrested around 4 in the morning, which meant he was still at that gas station for hours after I left, probably waiting for another woman to pull in alone. I thought about the dark sedan parked on the side of the building and wondered if there had been someone else in it, if he worked with a partner, if I had been even closer to danger than I realized. I called my sister and told her I would be late, that something had happened and I needed to take care of something first. Then I called the New Mexico State Police. A detective drove down from Socorro to meet me in Las Cruces that afternoon. Her name was Gutierrez, and she had a calm, steady presence that helped me keep it together while I gave my statement. I told her everything, the time I arrived, what he said, how he acted, the dark sedan, all of it. She took notes without interrupting, nodding occasionally, and when I finished she asked if I would consent to having my car examined by their forensic team. I said yes without hesitation. They found the puncture within minutes. It was a small, clean hole in the sidewall of my back passenger tire, made by something sharp and narrow, probably an awl or an ice pick. The forensic tech said it was designed to cause a slow leak, the kind that would not be immediately noticeable, but would leave me stranded within 20 or 30 miles. Detective Gutierrez told me later that they found the same tool in his truck, along with zip ties, duct tape, and a hunting knife with a serrated edge. She did not tell me what else they found in his truck, and I did not ask. Some things I do not need to know. I made it to Phoenix 2 days later, and finally held my nephew for the first time. He was so small, so completely unaware of anything beyond warmth and milk and sleep, and I remember crying while I held him in a way that confused my sister until I explained what had happened. She held me while I sobbed, and we stayed up most of that night talking about nothing and everything, the way sisters do when one of them has brushed up against something terrible. I still think about that night at the gas station more often than I would like to admit. Sometimes I wonder about the women who were not as lucky as me, who said yes when he offered to help, who got into his truck, or let him follow them to a quiet spot on the side of the road. I wonder if they had the same instinct I did and ignored it, or if they never felt anything wrong at all. Do not have nightmares about him anymore, but every time I stop at a gas station after dark, I check my tires before I go inside and again when I come out. I watch the parking lot. I keep my keys in my hand. And I never ever ignore that quiet voice in my gut that tells me something is not right. even when I cannot explain why. That voice is the only reason I am still here to tell this story. Moving into that cramped apartment on Riverside Drive felt like a victory after my divorce finalized, 37 and rebuilding from scratch. But at least I had my own space again. The building was nothing special, just 6 units spread across 3 floors, with paper-thin walls and a radiator that clanged like it was trying to communicate in Morse code. Most tenants kept to themselves, which suited me fine since I was pulling double shifts at the warehouse and barely had energy for small talk anyway. The only person I really knew was Mrs. Paulson from downstairs, who left homemade cookies outside my door every Sunday and always asked if I was eating enough. The unit directly across from mine, 3B, had been occupied since before I moved in. But in 4 months, I'd only glimpsed the tenant twice, both times around 3 in the morning when I was stumbling to the bathroom and caught him hauling black garbage bags down the hallway. Those bags stuck with me in a way I couldn't quite explain, the way he gripped them with both hands, leaning backward like he was dragging something impossibly dense. Normal garbage doesn't make a person's neck veins bulge like that, doesn't require shuffling sideways down the corridor to manage the weight. The first time I saw him, a tall guy with thinning hair and shoulders that seemed too broad for his narrow frame, I figured maybe he was disposing of old books or dumping cat litter from multiple boxes all at once. The second time, about 3 weeks later, same scenario. Dead of night, same type of bags, same labored movements. Except this time there was a wet sound as he dragged them past my door, like something inside had leaked and was creating suction against the plastic. He must have noticed my door was cracked because he stopped, turned his head just enough that I could see his profile in the dim hallway light, and stood there for maybe 10 seconds before continuing toward the stairwell. Everything changed on a Thursday night in early October, when I got home from my shift and found the hallway reeking of bleach mixed with something else. Something metallic and wrong that made my sinuses burn. The smell was coming from the ventilation grate between our doors, so strong it made my eyes water as I fumbled with my keys. I could hear sounds from inside 3B, a rhythmic scraping, like someone was dragging furniture across the floor in the same pattern over and over, accompanied by the occasional thud of something heavy dropping. For 20 minutes I sat on my couch, listening to that scraping through the shared wall, trying to convince myself it was just someone doing a deep clean or maybe refinishing their floors. But when the scraping stopped, I heard water running for what must have been 2 hours straight, the pipes in the walls groaning from the constant flow, and then silence so complete it felt like the apartment next door had become a vacuum. The next morning I caught our building manager, Eugene, near the mailboxes and mentioned the smell and the noise, trying to keep my tone casual like I was just making conversation. Eugene, a stocky guy who always wore the same paint-stained coveralls, barely looked up from sorting through a stack of late rent notices and mumbled something about how the tenant in 3B had informed him about doing some deep cleaning, dealing with a roach problem that required heavy-duty chemicals. That explanation might have satisfied me if I hadn't noticed the rust-colored stain seeping under the door of 3B later that afternoon, a thin line of reddish-brown liquid that had dried into a crust along the threshold. When I bent down to look closer, that metallic smell hit me again, stronger than the bleach, and I recognized it then. It was the same smell from the butcher shop where my dad used to work when I was a kid, that iron-heavy scent of blood that never quite washes out. I started paying attention after that, maybe more than I should have, keeping track of every sound that came through those walls. The guy in 3B kept bizarre hours. I'd hear his door open and close at 2, 3, 4 in the morning, always followed by those careful footsteps heading toward the stairwell. Sometimes I'd peek through my peephole when I heard him coming, watching as he emerged with another black bag, always holding it the same way, always moving with that same strained gait. Once, the bag had a tear in it, and something dark dripped onto the hallway carpet, leaving a trail of spots that were gone by morning, scrubbed away before anyone else would notice. I started a notebook, writing down dates and times like some kind of amateur detective, telling myself I was being paranoid while simultaneously unable to stop documenting every strange occurrence. October 10th, 3:15 a.m., heavy bags again. October 13th, chemical smell so strong I had to open all my windows. October 15th, found what looked like a fingernail in the hallway, but convinced myself it was just a piece of plastic. By the third week of October, I wasn't sleeping well anymore, jumping at every sound from next door, double-checking my locks whenever I heard his door open. Mrs. Paulson mentioned she'd been having nightmares, said the whole building felt different lately, like something bad had seeped into the walls. I wanted to tell her about my suspicions, but how do you explain to a 70-year-old woman that you think your neighbor might be doing something terrible without sounding completely unhinged? Instead, I went back to Eugene with more concerns, showed him photos I'd taken of the stains in the hallway, pointed out the frequency of the late-night activity. Eugene looked at me like I was wasting his time, said the tenant in 3B had never missed rent, never had any official complaints, and suggested maybe I should mind my own business if I wanted to keep enjoying the below-market rent we were all getting. That night around midnight, I heard footsteps stop right outside my door. No movement, just someone standing there breathing. And when I looked through the peephole, I saw the back of a head, like whoever it was had their face pressed against my door. I stayed frozen at that peephole for 5 minutes, watching that head remain perfectly still against my door, until finally the person stepped back, and I saw it was him, the tenant from 3B, just standing in the hallway staring at my door with this blank expression, his hands hanging at his sides. He stood there for another minute before turning and walking back to his apartment, closing the door with a soft click that somehow sounded more menacing than if he'd slammed it. Sleep was impossible after that, so I sat in my living room with a baseball bat across my lap, listening to the sounds coming through the wall. More scraping, more water running, and occasionally what sounded like a power tool, maybe a saw or a drill, running in short bursts. Around 4 in the morning, I heard his door open again, heard those familiar dragging sounds, and this time I forced myself to crack my door and watch as he hauled 2 bags toward the stairs, his face flushed with exertion, sweat staining the collar of his shirt. He glanced back once, caught me watching, and gave me this small nod, like we were just 2 neighbors acknowledging each other during a bout of insomnia. But his eyes stayed on mine a beat too long, cold and calculating. I called in sick to work the next day and drove to the police station, bringing my notebook and the photos on my phone, laying everything out for a bored-looking desk sergeant who typed up my statement with 2 fingers while yawning. He said they'd send someone to do a wellness check, standard procedure, but his tone suggested this would be filed away and forgotten like every other paranoid neighbor complaint they received. 3 days passed with no follow-up, and I was starting to think I'd have to move out, break my lease, and just eat the cost, when I noticed something that made my decision for me. Coming home from a late shift, I found my doormat had been moved, shifted just a few inches to the left, and underneath it was a single key, a copy of my apartment key, one I definitely hadn't lost or given to anyone. The only way someone could have gotten it was if they'd made an impression when I wasn't home, which meant he'd been in my apartment, going through my things, maybe standing in my bedroom while I was at work. I packed a bag that night, threw together enough clothes for a week, and went to stay at a motel near the interstate, one of those places that accepts cash and doesn't ask questions. For 2 weeks, I lived out of that dingy room, only returning to the apartment building during daylight hours to grab mail and more clothes, always checking the hallway before stepping out of the stairwell. Mrs. Paulson called me twice, worried because she hadn't seen me, and I made up some story about visiting family out of state, not wanting to frighten her with my suspicions. During those 2 weeks at the motel, I kept calling the police station, asking about the wellness check, getting transferred between departments until someone finally told me they'd knocked on the door of 3B. No one had answered, and without probable cause, that was all they could do. I even tried calling the FBI tip line, feeling ridiculous as I explained my concerns to an agent who politely took down the information and said they'd look into it if anything matched their existing cases. On a Monday morning in early November, my phone rang at 6:30. It was Eugene, his voice shaking, telling me to come to the building immediately but not to go inside, just wait in the parking lot. When I arrived, the entire block was cordoned off with yellow tape. Police cars everywhere, officers in tactical gear moving in and out of the building. A detective named Gillespie pulled me aside, showed me his badge and started asking questions about the tenant in 3B. When had I last seen him? Had I noticed anything unusual? Did I have any interaction with him? I handed over my notebook, showed him all the photos on my phone, and watched his expression change from professional detachment to genuine concern as he flipped through the pages. He stepped away to make a phone call, and when he came back, he told me they'd been tracking this man for 3 years across 4 states, that he was wanted in connection with at least 11 disappearances, and my reports had helped them finally pinpoint his location after he'd made a mistake disposing of evidence in a dumpster 2 blocks away. They kept us out of the building for 3 days while the forensics team worked, and when they finally let me back in to collect my belongings, the door to 3B was sealed with evidence tape, and the smell of chemicals was overwhelming. Detective Gillespie walked me to my apartment, waited while I packed everything I owned into boxes, and then dropped something that made my knees buckle. They'd found my spare key in the suspect's apartment, along with photos of me coming and going, dates and times matching my work schedule perfectly. The killer, whose real name was Theodore Marsh, had been studying me for months, had made notes about my routines, my habits, even recorded conversations through the thin walls. In his notebook, which Gillespie let me glimpse briefly, there was a page dedicated to me with a single word circled multiple times: later. The detective explained that Marsh had a pattern of selecting victims from his immediate environment, but would sometimes identify what he called future projects, people he planned to revisit after establishing himself somewhere new. The trial made national news. Theodore Marsh, the maintenance man killer as the media dubbed him, because he often took apartment maintenance jobs to gain access to victims. They found remains of 7 people in various states of decomposition inside the apartment walls, hidden behind false panels he'd constructed himself. I had to testify about what I'd observed, sitting in that courtroom while he stared at me with the same blank expression I'd seen that night at my door. He got multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, shipped off to a maximum security facility in another state. I never went back to that apartment building, couldn't even drive down that street for years afterward. Eugene sent me a check for my security deposit with a note apologizing for not taking my concerns seriously. Mrs. Paulson moved in with her daughter in Phoenix. The building was eventually demolished, turned into a parking lot for a new grocery store. Sometimes I drive by that parking lot, and I think about how close I came to being one of those remains in the walls, just another missing person case that might never have been solved if I hadn't trusted my instincts and gotten out when I did. When I signed the lease for that studio apartment in Denver, I cried in the leasing office. The property manager, this kind older woman named Beverly, thought something was wrong, but I told her they were happy tears. And they were. After 2.5 years of walking on eggshells, of having my phone checked daily, of being told who I could talk to and where I could go, I was finally signing something that was mine alone. No shared lease, no boyfriend's name anywhere on the paperwork. Just mine. I'd saved up for 8 months while working double shifts at the diner, hiding cash in a tampon box because I knew he'd never look there. The apartment was tiny, just 400 square feet on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse building, but it had tall windows that let in actual sunlight, and a door that locked from the inside with a deadbolt I could control. I changed my number the day I moved in, blocked him on everything, and told exactly 3 people where I was going: my sister in Minnesota, my best friend from high school, and my manager at the new restaurant job I'd lined up. I didn't post about the move, didn't update my location, didn't leave a forwarding address at the post office. For the first month, I barely slept. Every footstep in the hallway made me jump. Every time my phone buzzed, Even though it was a new number, my heart would slam against my ribs. But as April turned into May, and May crawled into early July, something strange happened. I started to relax. I'd wake up in the morning and make coffee without wondering if I'd brewed it wrong. I'd wear whatever I wanted without calculating whether it would start a fight. I made friends with my neighbor across the hall, this nurse named Felicity, who worked night shifts and would sometimes knock on my door at 7 in the morning to share leftover Thai food. I started taking a different route home from work each week, not out of fear anymore, but because I could. Because nobody was timing me or questioning why I was 12 minutes late. I even went on a date in late July, nothing serious, just drinks with a guy I met at a bookstore. Didn't go anywhere, but I realized halfway through that I wasn't scared anymore. I wasn't looking at the door every 5 minutes. I wasn't making excuses to leave early. I was just living, like a normal person, and it felt like learning to breathe again after holding my breath underwater for years. The first package arrived on a Wednesday in mid-July. I came home from my shift around 10 at night, exhausted and smelling like fryer grease, and there it was sitting outside my door. A small cardboard box, maybe the size of a shoebox, with my name written on it in black marker. No return address, no shipping label, just my name and apartment number written in this careful, blocky handwriting that made my stomach twist before my brain could catch up to why. I brought it inside and stared at it for 20 minutes before opening it. Inside was a snow globe, the cheap kind you get at tourist shops, with a tiny plastic diner inside and fake snow that swirled when you shook it. We'd bought one exactly like it on a road trip to Colorado Springs 2 years earlier, back when I still thought his jealousy was just him caring too much. He'd dropped it in a gas station parking lot a week later during a fight about me smiling at the cashier, and it had shattered all over the asphalt. I'd never mentioned that snow globe to anyone, never posted about it. It was such a small, forgettable moment in a relationship full of bigger, worse moments. But here it was, sitting on my kitchen counter, the fake snow settling around that stupid little diner, and I knew he'd found me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch with every light on, holding my phone, trying to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he'd sent it to my old address and somehow it got forwarded. Maybe I'd mentioned it to someone and forgotten. But the next morning, when I checked my Instagram, there were 3 failed login attempts between 2 and 4 in the morning. Then I checked my email. 2 more attempts. My Facebook, which I barely used anymore, had been locked due to suspicious activity. I changed all my passwords, enabled every security feature I could find, and told myself it was just random hackers, that this happened to everyone. The second package arrived 5 days later. This time it was a book, a paperback copy of this obscure mystery novel I'd been reading the week before I left him. I'd left my copy behind when I moved, left everything behind except my clothes and documents and the cash I'd saved. The book was dog-eared on page 147, the exact page I'd been on. Written in pencil in the margin was a single word in his handwriting: finish. I dropped it on the floor, my whole body trembling. I picked it up, shoved it in a trash bag, and took it directly to the dumpster outside. Then I called the police. The officer who came was polite, took notes, and told me there wasn't much they could do. I sat across from him at my tiny kitchen table, showing him the login attempts on my phone, explaining about the snow globe I'd already thrown away like an idiot, telling him about my ex, about the 2 years of control and manipulation, and the way he'd punched a hole in the wall 3 inches from my head the night I finally decided to leave. The officer nodded sympathetically and asked if I had proof that my ex had sent the packages. I didn't. No cameras in my hallway, no return address, no fingerprints I could magically produce. He asked if my ex had made any direct threats. I said no, not exactly, not in writing, not in any way I could prove. He explained that without evidence of a direct threat or violation of a restraining order I didn't have, there wasn't much they could pursue. He suggested I document everything, maybe look into getting a protective order, and call again if anything escalated. He gave me a case number and left. I stood in my doorway watching him walk down the stairs, and I felt more alone than I had the entire time I was with Nathan. At least back then, I knew where the danger was sleeping. Now it could be anywhere, watching, waiting, and nobody seemed to think that was enough of a problem to do anything about. I started documenting everything obsessively. I bought a cheap notebook from the dollar store and wrote down every login attempt. Every time I felt like someone was watching me, every car that seemed to idle too long in the parking lot. I asked Beverly if the building could install cameras in the hallways, and she said she'd bring it up with the owners but couldn't promise anything. Felicity noticed something was wrong, and when I finally told her the short version, she started walking me to my car after her night shifts ended. I changed my route home from work again, varying my schedule, never leaving at the same time twice. The third package came on a Friday, exactly 1 week after the second. This one was a photograph, printed on glossy paper, tucked inside a plain manila envelope. It was a picture of me walking into my apartment building, taken from across the street. I was wearing the blue sweater I'd bought 2 weeks earlier, the one I'd picked specifically because Nathan hated the color blue on me, said it made me look washed out. On the back of the photo, in that same careful handwriting, he'd written, "Blue looks good on you now, you've changed." I threw up in my kitchen sink. Then I called the police again. And again, they took notes. And again, nothing happened. The weeks that followed were a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. I stopped sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours a night, always jerking awake at the smallest sound. I started noticing things that might have been nothing, or might have been everything. A man in a baseball cap browsing the same aisle as me at the grocery store 2 days in a row. A silver sedan parked in the lot behind my building that I didn't recognize. My mail arriving already opened, then resealed with tape that didn't match the postal services. I reported everything, built a file so thick it could have been a novel, and still the answer was always the same. Without direct contact, without an explicit threat, without him physically touching me, there was nothing they could do. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow, then moved it to the nightstand because I kept having dreams where I accidentally cut myself. I put a chair under my doorknob every night like I'd seen in movies. I stopped going anywhere alone after dark. My manager at the restaurant started asking if I was okay, if I needed fewer shifts. And I almost laughed because fewer shifts meant less money, meant losing this apartment, meant going back to nothing. I couldn't afford to fall apart. I couldn't afford to let him win. But every morning I woke up feeling like I'd already lost something I couldn't name. Then came the Monday that changed everything. I got home from a double shift around 11 at night, bone-tired and thinking about nothing except taking a shower and collapsing into bed. The hallway was quiet, most of my neighbors already asleep, and I almost didn't notice it at first. But something made me look down as I reached for my keys, and there it was, a folded piece of paper tucked under my welcome mat, just the corner sticking out. Easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. I pulled it out with numb fingers and unfolded it right there in the hallway. Too exhausted to be careful. Too worn down to take it inside first. The handwriting was his. I'd seen it 1,000 times on grocery lists, on passive-aggressive notes left on the fridge, on the card he'd given me for our first anniversary that I'd stupidly kept for months. The note said, "I'm proud of the life you built. The apartment is nice. Felicity seems like a good friend. I chose a good place for you to start over." I read it 3 times before the words actually registered. He knew about Felicity. He knew her name. He'd been close enough to learn the name of my neighbor, which meant he'd been close enough to hear us talking, or to read her name off her mailbox, or to watch us walking together to the parking lot at dawn. I ran inside, locked every lock, shoved the chair under the door and sat on the floor with my back against the wall, clutching my phone, unable to move for what felt like hours. The next morning, I went straight to Beverly's office before my shift. I must have looked insane, dark circles under my eyes, still wearing yesterday's clothes, clutching that note in a plastic bag like it was evidence in a crime show. I told her everything, every detail I'd been too embarrassed or too scared to share before. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, She picked up her phone and called the building's owner directly. Within 2 hours, I was sitting in a small security office in the basement I hadn't even known existed, watching footage from the parking garage cameras with Beverly and a guy named Jerome, who handled maintenance and apparently also monitored the limited security system. We started with footage from the night before, around the time I would have gotten home, and worked backward. It took almost 40 minutes of scrubbing through grainy black and white footage before Jerome suddenly leaned forward and said, "Wait, go back." Beverly rewound the tape, and there he was. Nathan walking calmly through the parking garage at 6 in the morning 3 days earlier, wearing a maintenance uniform I didn't recognize. He had a key card. He swiped it like he belonged there, like he'd done it 100 times before, and the door to the stairwell clicked open without hesitation. My throat closed up so tight I couldn't breathe. Beverly asked me if I was sure it was him, and I couldn't even answer. Just nodded because I would recognize the way he walked in my sleep, that confident stride he used when he thought he was getting away with something. Jerome pulled up the tenant registry while Beverly kept rewinding through older footage. It didn't take long to find what we were looking for. 6 weeks earlier, almost exactly 2 weeks after I'd moved in, someone named Neil Travers had signed a lease for a studio apartment on the first floor. The signature was different, messier than Nathan's usual handwriting, but the emergency contact phone number listed on the application was 1 digit off from Nathan's mother's landline, a number I'd called dozens of times back when I still thought I might eventually be part of his family. Jerome pulled up more footage, and we watched Nathan, or Neil, coming and going at odd hours, always between 5 and 7 in the morning, always returning late at night. He'd been living in the same building as me for over a month, 40 feet below my apartment, using a fake name, paying rent, receiving mail, blending in like any other tenant. In one clip, I watched myself walk past him in the lobby. I didn't even glance in his direction. He was wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, and I was looking at my phone, completely unaware that the person I'd spent 8 months hiding from was standing close enough to touch me. Beverly's hand found mine and squeezed, and I realized I was crying. These awful silent tears streaming down my face while I watched myself almost die without knowing it. This time, when I called the police, I had evidence. I had footage of him entering the building with a stolen keycard. I had a lease application with a fake name and a traceable phone number. I had 6 weeks of recorded comings and goings that matched the timeline of every package, every login attempt, every moment I'd felt watched. 2 officers came within the hour, and Beverly handed over copies of everything. They ran the name Neil Travers and found nothing, which was enough to justify a welfare check on the apartment. I waited upstairs with Felicity, who'd called in sick to work the moment I told her what was happening, holding my hand so tight her knuckles went white. The knock on his door came at 2 in the afternoon. I know because I was watching the clock, counting every second, convinced he'd somehow slipped away, that he'd seen the police coming and vanished like smoke. But he hadn't. He opened the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, looking confused, looking innocent, and the officers asked him to confirm his identity. According to the report I read later, he kept up the act for almost 15 minutes before they showed him the footage of me walking past him in the lobby. Something in his face shifted then, they said. He stopped pretending and started explaining. He told them he just wanted to make sure I was safe, that he loved me too much to let me disappear, that he'd been waiting for the right moment to talk to me, to fix what I'd broken when I left without saying goodbye. They found a notebook in his apartment filled with my schedule, my shifts at the restaurant, the times Felicity and I went for coffee, the license plate of the car I'd bought used 3 weeks after moving. He'd been building a complete map of my life, waiting for the moment I'd be alone long enough for him to approach me. The arresting officer told me later that in his 20 years on the job, he'd never seen documentation that thorough. Nathan was charged with stalking, identity fraud, and criminal trespassing. The trial took 8 months, and I had to testify twice, had to sit in a courtroom and look at him while lawyers picked apart every detail of our relationship. He got 4 years, which his attorney tried to reduce to 2 with good behavior. But the judge saw the notebook and the footage and the pattern, and she gave him the maximum sentence allowed under Colorado law. I moved out of that apartment 3 days after his arrest, stayed with my sister in Minnesota until the trial was over, then relocated somewhere I'm not going to name because I've learned the hard way that safety isn't something you can take for granted. It's been almost 2 years now, and I still check the locks 3 times before bed. I still vary my route home. I still feel my heart jump when I see a silver sedan or a man in a baseball cap. But I also sleep through the night most weeks. I have a job I like and friends who know my real name, and a small apartment with a security system I paid for myself. Sometimes I think about that note he left under my welcome mat, about him saying he chose a good place for me to start over. He didn't choose anything for me. I chose it. I chose to leave. I chose to rebuild. And when he tried to take that from me, I chose to fight back. That's the part I hold on to when the fear creeps in. He's in a cell somewhere, and I'm here, free. Writing this down so that maybe someone else who's going through something similar knows that the system doesn't always fail you. Sometimes, if you document everything and don't give up, you get to be the one who walks away. My father died on a Saturday morning in March 2023, and I remember thinking that the timing seemed almost deliberate, like he had chosen the quietest possible moment to slip away. He was 74 years old, had been fighting lung cancer for almost 2 years, and the hospice nurse told us he went peacefully in his sleep at the house in rural Montana, where he had lived for the past 4 decades. I drove up from Denver that same afternoon, a 6-hour trip through mountain roads that I had made dozens of times before, but never under circumstances like these. My sister Corinne met me at the driveway, her eyes red and puffy, and we stood there hugging in the cold spring air while the sun set behind the pines. Our mother had passed away when we were kids, so it was just the 2 of us now, the last of the Pruitt family, standing in front of a house that suddenly felt impossibly large and impossibly empty. Corinne had already started making lists of what needed to be done, because that was how she coped with things, and I was grateful for her organizational instincts because my own mind felt like it was filled with static. The funeral was small, just a handful of neighbors and a few of my father's old colleagues from the lumber mill where he had worked as a foreman for 25 years before retiring. People said nice things about him, called him a quiet man, a private man, someone who kept to himself but was always willing to help when you needed it. I nodded along and shook hands and accepted casseroles wrapped in aluminum foil, and through it all I kept thinking about the garage. That might sound strange, but you have to understand something about my father and that garage. It was his domain, his sanctuary, the one place in the house where nobody else was allowed to go without his explicit permission. As a kid, I learned very quickly that the garage was off limits, not because he ever hit me or anything like that, but because the one time I wandered in there looking for a bicycle pump, he found me and his face transformed into something I had never seen before. Pure, absolute fury, the kind that makes your whole body go cold. He grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises and dragged me out of there, and he did not speak to me for 3 days afterward. After that incident, which happened when I was maybe 9 or 10, I never went near the garage again. Neither did Corinne, neither did anyone. My father kept a heavy padlock on the side door and another on the main garage door, and he carried the keys on a chain attached to his belt at all times. When I got older and started asking questions, he would just stare at me with those pale gray eyes of his and say, it was none of my business, that a man was entitled to his privacy, that some things were not meant to be shared. I assumed he was building something in there, maybe a boat or some kind of woodworking project, something he wanted to keep secret until it was finished. That was the story I told myself anyway, the explanation that let me sleep at night and not think too hard about why my own father treated one room of his house like it contained nuclear launch codes. Corinne had her own theory, which was that he was hoarding money in there, cash he did not want the government to know about. We even joked about it sometimes, called it Fort Knox, laughed nervously whenever the subject came up. But now he was gone, and someone had to deal with the property. Corinne had a husband and 2 kids back in Seattle, a job she could not take more than a week off from, so the task of cleaning out the house fell mostly to me. I worked remotely as a software developer, which meant I could set up my laptop anywhere with decent Wi-Fi and keep billing hours while I sorted through 40 years of accumulated belongings. The first few days were exactly what you would expect. Endless trips to the donation center with boxes of old clothes, arguments with Corinne over the phone about what to keep and what to throw away, moments of unexpected grief when I found something like my mother's handwriting on a recipe card tucked inside a cookbook. I avoided the garage. I told myself I was saving it for last, that I needed to deal with the easier stuff first. But the truth was that I was scared. Not scared of what I might find exactly, but scared of finally knowing what my father had been hiding all those years. Scared that the answer might change everything I thought I knew about him. On the 8th day after the funeral, I ran out of excuses. The house was mostly empty. The paperwork was sorted, and the only thing left was the garage and whatever waited inside. I found the keys in a small wooden box on my father's nightstand, right where the hospice nurse said they would be. There were 3 of them on a tarnished brass ring, each one worn smooth from decades of use. My hands felt numb as I walked across the backyard toward the side door, the spring mud sucking at my boots with every step. The garage was a separate structure from the main house, a concrete block building with no windows and a roof covered in green moss. Looked like a bunker, like something designed to keep people out. And standing in front of it, I understood for the first time just how much effort my father had put into making sure nobody ever saw what was inside. I fitted the first key into the padlock, turned it, and heard the mechanism click open with a sound that seemed much too loud in the quiet afternoon air. The smell hit me before I even got the door fully open, a thick, musty odor of dust and old paper, and something else underneath, something faintly metallic that I could not quite identify. I fumbled for a light switch along the interior wall and found one, a single bare bulb that flickered twice before casting a weak yellow glow across the space. The garage was smaller than I remembered, maybe 20 feet by 15, with concrete floors and walls lined with metal shelving units. Most of the shelves held exactly what you would expect in a garage: old paint cans and rusted tools and boxes of nails and screws. But against the far wall, directly opposite the door, stood a tall metal cabinet with a padlock of its own. It was industrial looking, the kind of thing you might see in a high school locker room, painted a dull gray that had chipped in places to reveal darker gray underneath. I knew immediately that this was what my father had been protecting all along. Not the garage itself, but whatever was locked inside that cabinet. The second key on the ring fit the padlock perfectly, and when I pulled the doors open, the hinges screamed like they had not moved in years. The first thing I saw was the jewelry. Rings, necklaces, bracelets, earrings. All of them tangled together in a shallow cardboard box on the top shelf. Some of the pieces looked expensive, gold and silver with gemstones that caught the light, while others were cheap costume stuff, the kind you might buy at a drugstore. None of it belonged to my mother. I knew that immediately because my mother had never owned much jewelry, and what little she had, Corinne and I had divided between us after she died. Below the jewelry box there was a stack of wallets, maybe 15 or 20 of them, all different styles and colors and states of wear. I picked one up with trembling fingers and opened it to find a California driver's license belonging to a woman named Denise Hartley, born in 1961, with an address in Sacramento. The photo showed a thin blonde woman with tired eyes and a smile that did not quite reach them. I picked up another wallet and found a license for a man named Theodore Baines from Portland, Oregon. Another one belonged to someone named Yolanda Fitch from Boise, Idaho. Every single wallet contained an ID, and every single ID belonged to someone I had never heard of. Someone with no connection to my family or my father's life as far as I knew. My legs gave out and I sat down hard on the cold concrete floor, still holding one of the wallets in my hand. I stayed there for a long time, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 20, just staring at the open cabinet and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There had to be an explanation, I kept telling myself. Maybe my father collected lost wallets. Maybe he found them on the road during his business trips and always meant to mail them back, but never got around to it. But even as I formed that thought, I knew it was ridiculous. Knew it the way you know something in your bones before your brain catches up. Because underneath the wallets there were other things. Things that made the innocent explanation impossible. A woman's floral blouse, carefully folded, with a dark stain on the collar that I refused to look at too closely. A man's leather belt with the initials TB stamped into it. A child's sneaker, just one, size 6, faded pink with a cartoon character on the side that I vaguely recognized from the 80s. And stuffed into the corner of the bottom shelf, a manila envelope thick with newspaper clippings that had yellowed with age. I do not remember deciding to open the envelope, only that suddenly the clippings were spread out on the floor in front of me, and I was reading them one by one with a kind of numb detachment, like I was watching someone else go through the motions. The headlines blurred together at first, but certain words kept jumping out at me. Missing, vanished, last seen, foul play suspected. The articles came from newspapers all over the western states, places like Reno and Salt Lake City, and Spokane and Billings, and they spanned nearly 3 decades from the late 70s to the mid-2000s. Each one told the story of someone who had disappeared without a trace, someone whose family was desperate for answers, someone who had simply walked out of their life one day and never came back. Denise Hartley, the woman from the first wallet I had opened, was there in a clipping from 1989. She had vanished from a rest stop along Interstate 80 while driving home from visiting her sister. Theodore Baines had disappeared in 1994 while hitchhiking through Montana. Yolanda Fitch had gone missing in 2003 after leaving a bar in downtown Boise. There were others too, names I did not recognize because I had not looked through all the wallets yet. But I knew if I matched them up, I would find a wallet or a piece of jewelry or a scrap of clothing for every single one. I called the police that night, or maybe I should say I called them the next morning, because by the time I finished going through everything in that cabinet, it was well past midnight. A deputy from the county sheriff's office came out first, a young guy with a patchy beard who clearly thought he was responding to some kind of prank call. But then he saw the cabinet and the wallets and the clippings, and his face went pale, and he stepped back outside to radio for backup. Within 2 hours, there were 6 patrol cars in the driveway, and crime scene tape stretched across the garage door, and people in latex gloves carrying evidence bags back and forth, while I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket someone had given me. A detective named Ingram sat down next to me at some point, a heavy-set woman in her 50s with short gray hair, and a voice that managed to be both gentle and absolutely serious at the same time. She asked me questions for what felt like hours, questions about my father, about his habits, about whether I had ever suspected anything, about the business trips he used to take when I was a kid. Those business trips, it turned out, were the key to everything. My father had worked as a foreman at the lumber mill, but what I did not know, what I had never thought to question, was that his job also required him to travel several times a year to meet with suppliers and inspect timber operations in other states. He would be gone for a week or 2 at a time, sometimes longer, and when he came back, he never talked about where he had been or what he had done. I always assumed it was boring work stuff, the kind of thing a kid would not care about anyway. But Detective Ingram told me that investigators in at least 4 states had been looking at my father for years, going back to the early 90s when a witness reported seeing a man matching his description talking to Yolanda Fitch outside that bar in Boise the night she disappeared. They never had enough evidence to arrest him, never had anything concrete that would hold up in court. Just a pattern of travel that seemed to coincide with disappearances and a gut feeling that something was wrong. She told me they had even interviewed him once back in 1998 about a missing woman in Wyoming. But he had an alibi that checked out, and they had to let him go. All those years, she said, they knew something was not right about him, but they could never prove it. And now here was the proof, locked in a cabinet in his garage, waiting for someone to finally open it. I stayed in Montana for another 3 weeks while the investigation unfolded, answering more questions, providing DNA samples, signing documents that gave the police permission to dig up parts of the property. They found remains buried in the woods behind the house, 4 sets of bones in shallow graves that my father had apparently dug over the course of several decades. Dental records confirmed that 2 of them matched people from the newspaper clippings, including Denise Hartley, the woman whose wallet I had opened first. The forensic team estimated there could be more, scattered across multiple states along the routes my father used to travel, and the FBI got involved at some point because the crimes crossed so many jurisdictions. Corinne flew out when the news broke nationally, and we sat together in a motel room watching our father's face appear on cable news, listening to reporters describe him as a suspected serial killer who had evaded justice for over 30 years. She kept asking me if I remembered anything, any sign that something was wrong, and I kept telling her no. I did not. He was just our father, quiet and private, and sometimes angry, but never anything that made me think he was capable of this. But that was a lie, or at least not the whole truth, because I did remember something I had buried so deep I almost convinced myself it never happened. I was 12 years old, and my father had just come back from one of his trips. It was late, past midnight, and I woke up because I heard the truck pulling into the driveway. I got out of bed and went to my window, which looked out over the backyard and the garage beyond it. The moon was full that night, bright enough that I could see everything clearly, and I watched my father get out of the truck and walk around to the passenger side. He opened the door and pulled something out, something large and heavy that he carried over his shoulder like a rolled-up carpet. Except it was not a carpet. I knew that even then, knew it from the way it bent in places a carpet would not bend, knew it from the glimpse of pale skin I caught in the moonlight before he disappeared into the garage. I stood at that window for a long time, waiting for him to come back out, and when he finally did, his clothes were different and he was carrying a garbage bag that he threw into the bed of the truck. He looked up at the house then, and for one terrible moment I thought he saw me, thought our eyes met across the darkness. But he just stood there for a few seconds and then went inside. And the next morning at breakfast, he was the same as always, quiet and distant and completely unreadable. I never told anyone what I saw. I was 12 years old and I did not have the words for it, did not have the framework to understand what it meant. So I did what children do when reality becomes too frightening to accept. I convinced myself it was a dream, a nightmare, something my imagination had invented. And eventually, I believed it. I live in Denver now, same apartment I had before any of this happened, same job, same routine. The house in Montana was seized as part of the investigation, and I do not know what will happen to it, do not really care. Corinne and I talk on the phone every few weeks, but there is a distance between us now that was not there before, a shared trauma that neither of us knows how to process. The FBI identified 11 victims in total, spanning from 1978 to 2006, though they suspect there may be others they will never find. My father, they told me, fit a specific profile, someone who targeted vulnerable people, drifters and hitchhikers and runaways, people whose disappearances would not make headlines, people who nobody would look too hard for. He was patient and careful and methodical, and if he had not kept those souvenirs in his cabinet, if he had not held on to the proof of what he had done, he would have died as nothing more than a quiet old man who kept to himself. Sometimes I wonder why he saved those things, whether it was arrogance or compulsion, or some twisted need to remember. Sometimes I wonder if he wanted to be caught, if leaving those keys on his nightstand was his final confession. But mostly I try not to wonder about anything at all. I go to work and I come home, and I do not think about the man who raised me, the man who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my homework, and sat across from me at the dinner table for 18 years while carrying secrets that would have destroyed everything if I had known. He was my father. He was also a monster, and I have to live with both of those truths for the rest of my life. Around 11 on a Wednesday night, I found myself pushing a shopping cart through the fluorescent maze of a Kroger in suburban Atlanta. My sister had just given birth to twins 3 days earlier, and I had volunteered to do her grocery run since her husband was working night shifts at the hospital. At 26, fresh off a breakup that left me crashing on my parents' couch, I figured helping out was the least I could do to feel useful. The store was practically deserted at that hour. Just a teenager restocking cereal boxes and an elderly man contemplating yogurt flavors in the dairy aisle. I remember the muzak playing some watered-down version of a Beatles song, the kind of detail that sticks with you after something terrible almost happens. My cart squeaked with every rotation of its front left wheel, this rhythmic complaint that echoed through empty aisles. I grabbed everything on the list: diapers, formula, those specific crackers my sister craved during pregnancy and apparently still wanted. The whole trip took maybe 40 minutes, and I was thinking about nothing more significant than whether I should grab myself a bag of chips for the drive home. The parking lot sprawled out in front of the store like a concrete ocean, maybe 200 spaces with only about 15 cars scattered across it. Most of them clustered near the entrance, but I had parked further out near a broken lamppost because it was the only spot I could find when I arrived earlier, and the lot was busier. Now, walking toward my car with 4 plastic bags cutting into my fingers, I noticed how quiet everything had become. The highway noise that usually hummed in the background seemed muted, absorbed by the humid Georgia air. My footsteps sounded impossibly loud against the asphalt, each step a small announcement of my location. I was maybe 30 feet from my car, a silver Camry that my dad had passed down to me after buying himself a truck, when I noticed movement between 2 vehicles about 20 feet to my left. A man stepped out from behind a dark SUV, and even from that distance I could tell he was looking directly at me. He started walking in my direction with this purposeful stride that made my chest tighten. Not running, not casual, but deliberate, like someone who had been waiting. He was probably in his late 40s, wearing a beige jacket that looked too warm for the weather and jeans that seemed brand new, stiff and dark. His hair was thinning on top, combed back in a way that revealed a prominent forehead with deep creases. What struck me most was how normal he looked, not disheveled, not obviously threatening, just an average man you might see anywhere. He raised one hand in a wave as he approached, and his face arranged itself into something resembling friendliness, though his eyes stayed fixed on me with an intensity that the smile never reached. "Hey there," he called out when he was about 15 feet away, still closing the distance. "Sorry to bother you, but I think I know that car." He pointed toward my Camry, and I instinctively looked at it, which meant taking my eyes off him for a second. When I looked back, he had covered another 5 feet. My grip tightened on the plastic bags, the handles digging deeper into my palms. Every instinct told me to keep moving, but something about his tone, conversational, almost neighborly, made me hesitate. "Excuse me?" I said, and I hated how my voice came out smaller than I intended. He stopped about 8 feet away, close enough that I could see the stubble on his chin and a small scar above his left eyebrow, shaped like a crescent moon. "That Camry," he said, nodding toward my car again. "Silver, right? 2012 or 2013? I swear I know that car from somewhere. You live around Decatur?" I shook my head, taking a small step backward. "No, I think you have me confused with someone else." He tilted his head like a dog hearing a strange sound, and that gesture sent a ripple of unease through me. "You sure? Because I could swear I have seen you before. Maybe at the Publix on Memorial Drive, the gas station near the elementary school." Each location he named felt like a probe, a fishing expedition designed to extract information. I realized he was moving again, not toward me directly but angling slightly to my right, positioning himself between me and the most direct path to my car. The bags in my hands suddenly felt like anchors, weighing me down when I needed to be light and fast. "I really need to go," I said, forcing my feet to move. I angled left, away from him, planning to loop around and approach my car from a different direction. But he matched my movement, stepping sideways to maintain that invisible barrier between me and the Camry. Hold on," he said, and there was something different in his voice now, a slight edge creeping in beneath the friendly facade. I am just trying to figure this out. It is driving me crazy. What is your name? Maybe I know your family. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and I became hyper-aware of everything around me. The distant hum of a car on the highway, the flickering of a working lamppost 2 rows over, the complete absence of any other human being within shouting distance. The store entrance seemed impossibly far away, a rectangle of light that might as well have been on another planet. I thought about screaming, but something told me that would escalate things in a way I could not control. Instead, I kept my voice as steady as I could manage and said, "I do not know you. Please leave me alone." His expression shifted then, just slightly, the mask slipping for half a second. I saw something cold underneath, something calculating. "That is not very friendly," he said, and he took another step closer. We were maybe 5 feet apart now. I could smell cigarette smoke clinging to his jacket mixed with something else, a chemical smell, like industrial cleaner. "I'm just being neighborly here, trying to make a connection. You know how rare that is these days. Everyone is so paranoid, so unfriendly." He kept talking, a steady stream of words that felt designed to keep me in place, to make me doubt my own instincts. Maybe he was just lonely. Maybe I was overreacting. Those thoughts flickered through my mind even as every cell in my body screamed at me to run. I glanced to my right and saw a narrow gap between a pickup truck and a minivan, just wide enough for me to squeeze through. Beyond that, there was an open stretch of pavement leading to the store entrance. If I could get through that gap before he could react, I might make it. I shifted my weight onto the balls of my feet, the plastic bags rustling slightly with the movement. He must have seen something change in my posture because his hand shot out and grabbed my wrist before I could take a single step. His grip was tight, fingers digging into the soft skin above my hand, and I felt the shock of contact surge through me like electricity. "Hey now," he said, his voice dropping lower, losing all pretense of friendliness. "Where are you going? We are just talking here. No need to be rude." Up close, I could see his eyes clearly for the first time, pale blue, almost gray, with pupils that seemed too large for the amount of light in the parking lot. There was nothing behind them that I recognized as human warmth. I yanked my arm back, hard, and he released me but moved forward at the same time, hurting me backward until my hip collided with the side mirror of a parked sedan. The impact sent a jolt of pain through my side, and I dropped 2 of the grocery bags. Cans rolled across the asphalt, making hollow sounds as they scattered. "Look what you made me do," I said, the words coming out in a rush, my brain grasping for anything that might normalize this situation, might return us to a world where strangers did not grab you in parking lots. "Just pick them up," he said, gesturing at the fallen groceries. "I will wait." And that was when I understood with absolute clarity what was happening. He wanted me to bend down, to make myself smaller, more vulnerable, to take my eyes off him. The way he stood there, blocking my path to the open lot, angling me further into the canyon formed by parked cars. This was not random. This was practiced. I thought about a true crime podcast I had listened to during my commute. Something about predators choosing locations and timing, about how they test boundaries before escalating. Every interaction so far had been a test. The friendly wave. The questions about where I lived. The grab when I tried to leave. Each one pushing a little further, seeing how I would react. My mind raced through options. I could scream, but the store was so far away, and who knew if anyone would hear. I could fight, but he was bigger than me and I had no idea if he was armed. I could try to run, but he had already shown he was faster than he looked. The keys in my pocket pressed against my thigh, and I remembered something my mother had told me years ago about holding your keys between your fingers like a weapon. I did not pick up the groceries. Instead, I took a deep breath and screamed as loud as I could. Not a word, just a raw, primal sound that tore out of my throat and echoed across the empty lot. The man flinched, his eyes darting toward the store entrance, and in that half-second of distraction I bolted. I ran straight for the gap between the pickup and minivan, squeezing through so fast that the minivan's mirror scraped against my arm, leaving a burning line of pain I barely registered. Behind me, I heard him curse and the sound of his footsteps pounding against the pavement. I did not look back. I just ran, my lungs already burning, my legs pumping harder than they had since high school track practice. The store entrance grew larger with every stride, 50 feet, 40, 30. I could hear him getting closer, his breathing heavy and ragged, and I pushed myself faster, faster, until I burst through the automatic doors and nearly collided with a display of energy drinks. The teenager who had been stocking shelves looked up with wide eyes and I gasped out the words, "Call the police," before doubling over, hands on my knees trying to catch my breath. The kid must have seen something in my face because he did not ask questions, just pulled out his phone and dialed. I turned around and looked through the glass doors, my heart still slamming against my chest. The man was standing at the edge of the parking lot, right where the overhead lights gave way to shadow. He was just watching, not moving, his hands hanging loose at his sides. Even from that distance, I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and cold. Then a car pulled into the lot. A woman in a minivan, probably coming for a late-night grocery run just like I had, and he turned and walked away. Not running, not hurried, just a casual stroll like he had all the time in the world. He disappeared between two rows of parked cars, and a moment later I heard an engine start somewhere in the darkness. By the time the police arrived 12 minutes later, he was long gone. The woman in the minivan had seen nothing, noticed nothing. To her, it was just an ordinary Wednesday night. She had no idea what had almost happened in the same lot where she was now parking her car and checking her grocery list. 2 officers took my statement inside the store, in a small break room that smelled like burnt coffee and microwave dinners. I described everything I could remember. The beige jacket, the crescent scar, the pale eyes, the dark SUV he had been standing near, which was gone by the time we checked. They asked me if I had gotten a license plate number, and I had not. Of course I had not. Because who thinks about license plates when they are running for their life? One of the officers, a woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, kept exchanging glances with her partner in a way that made me nervous. When I finished talking, she asked if I could come down to the station the next day to look at some photographs. "Has this happened before?" I asked, and the silence that followed told me everything. They would not confirm anything that night, just said they were investigating similar incidents and my description might help. I drove home in a daze, checking my rearview mirror every 30 seconds, jumping at every set of headlights that appeared behind me. My sister's groceries sat in the passenger seat, and I remember thinking how absurd it was that I still had them, that somewhere in the chaos of running and screaming I had managed to hold onto 2 of the 4 bags. 3 days later, a detective named Reginald Okonkwo called me. He had a deep voice, calm and measured, the kind of voice that probably helped people feel safe when they were falling apart. He told me they had arrested a man matching my description at a Target parking lot in Marietta, about 20 miles from the Kroger where I had encountered him. A security guard had noticed him approaching a woman loading groceries into her car, using the same routine. The friendly wave, the questions about the car looking familiar. This time, someone had intervened before anything could happen. When they searched his vehicle, they found zip ties, a hunting knife, and a roll of duct tape in a duffel bag in the trunk. They also found 2 driver's licenses that did not belong to him. The detective paused before telling me the next part, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. 2 women had gone missing from grocery store parking lots in the Atlanta area over the previous 6 weeks. Both had been found, alive but traumatized, in a foreclosed house on the outskirts of the city. The man had held them for several days before releasing them in remote locations. He had used the same approach with both of them, pretending to recognize their car, asking friendly questions, positioning himself to cut off their escape routes. I was going to be his third. His name was Dennis Lamar Finch, 47 years old, a former appliance repair technician who had lived alone in a rented apartment less than 10 miles from my parents' house. The news covered the arrest for a few days, showing his mugshot on every local channel. That same unremarkable face, those same pale eyes staring blankly at the camera. Watching him on television, you would never guess what he was capable of. He looked like someone who might fix your refrigerator or wave at you from across the street while watering his lawn. That was the part that stayed with me, long after the trial, long after he was sentenced. The complete normalcy of him. I testified at the trial, sat in that witness box and described every detail of that night while he watched me from the defense table. He never showed any emotion, not when I talked about him grabbing my wrist, not when the other victims described what he had done to them. Just that same blank expression, like he was watching something mildly boring on television. The jury took less than 4 hours to convict him on all counts. He got 45 years, no possibility of parole. It has been almost 4 years now, and I still do not shop alone at night. I park as close to store entrances as possible, even if it means circling the lot 5 times. I keep my keys in my hand the moment I step outside, and I have taken 2 self-defense classes. My therapist says these are normal responses to trauma, that my brain is just trying to protect me from something that already happened. Maybe she is right, but sometimes, late at night, I think about how close I came to disappearing. I think about those 2 other women, what they went through in that foreclosed house, and I wonder what he had planned for me. I think about that moment in the parking lot when he told me to pick up the groceries, and how easy it would have been to just do it. To doubt myself, to be polite, to ignore every alarm bell ringing in my head. That is what scares me most. Not the memory of his face or his voice or his grip on my wrist. It is knowing how close I came to making a different choice, to being too afraid to scream, too polite to run. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Do not worry about being rude. Do not worry about overreacting. Just get out, get somewhere safe, and worry about embarrassment later. Embarrassment fades. The alternative does not. Most of this happened during a stretch of my life when I was juggling long shifts at a small marketing firm, and spending most evenings alone in my apartment, trying to distract myself from how stagnant everything felt. Matching with someone online wasn't unusual for me, but meeting someone who seemed genuinely attentive from the very first message caught me off guard. He introduced himself as Ethan, mentioned he worked in consulting, and had this way of asking questions that made me feel like he was actually listening. I remember sitting on my couch that night eating leftover pasta, surprised at how naturally the conversation flowed. He wasn't pushing anything weird, wasn't making inappropriate jokes, just easy, calm exchanges that somehow made the room feel warmer. By the time I went to bed, I was smiling like an idiot, wondering how someone like him had even noticed me. The momentum between us picked up fast in a way that felt flattering at first, as if I'd stepped into some alternate version of my life, where I mattered more than I realized. Ethan would send these short voice messages in the mornings, sounding half awake and friendly, talking about grabbing overpriced lattes before work, or rushing to catch a meeting he claimed to be running late for. He didn't just text "good morning." He'd say things like how he hoped the weather held up for my commute, or how he thought I deserved a quieter day. Small things, but no one had spoken to me like that in a long time. Within a week, he suggested meeting in person, and even though the pace was making me nervous, I let myself get swept up in it. The attention felt intoxicating, like someone had finally decided I was worth choosing. When we met for the first time at a small cafe near a busy downtown street, he showed up wearing a navy jacket with scuffed elbows and a watch that looked older than he claimed it was. His hair was neatly cut, but one side stuck up like he'd been in a rush and hadn't noticed. He smiled easily, not forced or awkward, and his laugh came out in these short, breathy bursts that made other people at nearby tables glance over. We talked about travel, work, hobbies, and he had an answer for everything. Smooth, confident, polished in a way I couldn't quite place. Still, he paid for everything without blinking and walked me back to my car like he'd known me forever. I told myself the annoying tug in my chest wasn't fear. It was just unfamiliar excitement. Over the next couple of weeks, Ethan's generosity escalated. He sent food to my apartment on nights he knew I was working late, bought concert tickets for a band I'd mentioned once in passing, and even sent a small package with a book he said reminded him of me. It all felt flattering, but there were moments that didn't line up cleanly. He'd mention a project at work, and then forget he'd already described it differently 2 days earlier. He said he'd grown up in a coastal town, but later mentioned being from the Midwest. When I teased him lightly about the contradictions, he brushed them off with a quick joke, or changed the subject entirely. None of it felt alarming yet, but there were little threads that tugged at my attention when I lay awake at night replaying conversations. I kept telling myself that everyone exaggerates sometimes, and maybe I was reading too much into it. One evening, while Ethan was supposedly on a business trip, he called me from what sounded like a busy hotel lobby. His voice carried that same warm tone, but behind it I could hear overlapping conversations and the clatter of dishes, almost like a restaurant rather than a hotel. He said he'd call me again once he got to his room, but the second call never came. Instead, he texted a blurry photo of a suitcase near a generic carpeted hallway. Something about the image felt strange. The angle, the lighting, even the suitcase itself looked different from the one he'd carried when we met. I brushed it aside at first, telling myself it was a pointless detail to fixate on. But that night, lying in bed, I kept replaying the sound of all those voices behind him, wondering why it didn't match any hotel lobby I'd ever been in. The next morning, I did something I hadn't planned. I searched his full name online. Not a deep search, just the usual quick look everyone does at some point. Nothing reliable came up. Not a LinkedIn profile, not old pictures, not anything that matched the man I'd met. His phone number traced back to an area nowhere near the city he claimed he lived in. When I asked him casually about his workplace later that day, he gave me a company name I'd never heard of and muttered something about their private contract work, as if that explained the lack of information. It wasn't enough to raise an alarm on its own, but the gaps were widening, and my mind kept drifting back to those small inconsistencies that were starting to pile up. A few days later, while waiting for him outside a bookstore where we'd planned to meet, I watched the minutes tick by with no sign of him. He finally texted saying he'd been called into an emergency meeting and couldn't make it. The strange part was what happened right afterward. A woman approached me, maybe in her 30s, with her hair tied back and a faded canvas tote slung over her shoulder. She asked if I was waiting for someone named Ethan. The question hit me so sharply, it felt like someone had pulled a string inside my chest. She explained that she wasn't trying to pry, but she thought she recognized my situation because she'd been through something similar. Before I could respond, she apologized and walked away briskly, disappearing into a crowd at the crosswalk. I didn't chase her. I just stood there holding my phone, wondering what exactly she had meant. That encounter shook me more than I wanted to admit, so that night I dug a little deeper. It started harmlessly, reverse image searching the pictures he'd sent me. 2 of them came up blank, but one matched an account that had been deleted years ago. The image tied to a username with barely any archived posts. The colors in the profile photo looked slightly altered, as if someone had edited it to appear newer. I tried searching his workplace again with different spellings, different keywords, and eventually I found an old forum thread where people mentioned a man using multiple identities tied to consulting work that didn't actually exist. No full names, no photos, but the descriptions lined up almost perfectly with Ethan's stories. My chest tensed as I read every line, feeling more and more like I'd stepped into a version of someone else's nightmare without realizing it. The turning point came when I messaged Ethan that I needed some time to think. I didn't accuse him of anything. I barely hinted at my doubts. Within minutes, his tone shifted. He went from affectionate to oddly defensive, insisting that he'd opened up more to me than to anyone else, and that he hoped I wasn't buying into rumors. I hadn't mentioned any rumors. His reaction felt strangely rehearsed, as if he'd given that same speech to someone else before. When I didn't reply right away, he sent a long paragraph about trust, timing, and how people love to tear down anyone who seems successful. Something in the way he wrote, too polished, too perfectly phrased, made the air in my apartment feel heavy. I set my phone down and didn't respond until the next day. When morning came, a message from an unknown number popped up on my screen. It was short, almost clipped. "Be careful. He did this to my cousin." No details, no name attached, just that sentence. A second text followed a minute later with a screenshot of a police bulletin, blurred, but clear enough to make out a familiar jawline and the slant of a crooked eyebrow. It wasn't Ethan's name underneath the photo, though. It was a completely different one. Seeing that picture, even with the poor resolution, sent a wave of realization through me. Ethan wasn't just bending the truth. He was built entirely out of lies. The bulletin mentioned financial manipulation, emotional coercion, and a pattern of disappearing before charges progressed. My pulse hammered in my ears as I read it over and over, finally accepting that whoever I'd been talking to wasn't who he pretended to be. Eventually, I contacted a detective whose name was listed on the bulletin. I half expected them to tell me it was outdated or incomplete, but instead they asked for my address and came by later that afternoon. The detective, a calm man with silver streaks in his hair and a battered leather notebook, listened carefully while I recounted everything. He told me the individual I knew as Ethan had cycled through at least 4 identities in recent years, and that multiple partners had come forward with stories disturbingly similar to mine. What shocked me most was learning how calculated it all was. Each relationship starting with harmless charm, building into extravagant generosity, and ultimately ending with accounts drained or credit cards opened without consent. I felt sick hearing it laid out like that, realizing how close I'd come to losing everything. Cutting contact wasn't as simple as blocking his number. For days afterward, I kept getting calls from unknown area codes, silence on the other end each time. One afternoon, a delivery driver dropped a package at my door, a book wrapped in brown paper with no return address. It was the same title Ethan had gifted me before, only this copy was brand new, still sealed in plastic. I reported it immediately, and the detective assured me they were tracking every attempt he made to reach out. Eventually, the calls stopped, and no more packages came. Life settled back into something resembling normal, though I'm not sure I'll ever fully relax the way I used to. Every now and then, when I walk past that bookstore where the woman approached me, I catch myself scanning the crowd, wondering how many people have crossed paths with him without realizing it. I didn't lose money, but I lost the version of myself that believed a kind voice and steady attention were proof of someone's character. I remember that period of my life as a time when everything felt predictable in the best way. I worked in a mid-sized distribution office, handling order coordination during the late shifts, usually leaving after most people were already gone. My routine rarely changed. Coffee on the way in, headphones during the first hour of sorting emails, lunch with the same handful of coworkers who liked quiet tables. That consistency made it easy to notice when someone new began drifting into my orbit. His name was Colin, a recent transfer from another branch. He didn't draw attention to himself. If anything, he blended into the background so well that people often forgot he was in the room. Still, he'd offer small comments here and there. Nothing strange, just polite observations about workloads or how chaotic certain shifts could get. The acquaintance started because we happened to clock out around the same time for about a week. He'd walk beside me toward the staff exit, not talking much, and honestly, I didn't think anything of it. He didn't radiate confidence or charm. He just seemed like someone who hadn't quite figured out how to make friends in a new place. I'd respond when he spoke, ask basic things like how he was adjusting or whether he'd settled into the system yet. It felt harmless, a workplace courtesy, something you do so the environment doesn't feel stiff. I never sensed anything intense behind his comments, no undertones of interest or anything that would make me question the small talk. The first shift where things shifted, I was updating a shipment log when he approached, leaning slightly over the edge of my desk. He asked if I wanted to grab a drink after work. The way he asked wasn't inappropriate, but something about his expression made it clear he expected a specific answer. I kept my tone light, told him I didn't go out with coworkers but appreciated the offer. He nodded, said, "Of course," and walked off without any visible reaction. I genuinely thought that would be the end of it. just a moment of awkwardness that would fade with time. But over the next days, he kept appearing at my workstation without a sound, standing too close, watching my screen like he had some responsibility over what I was doing. At first, I told myself he was just trying to be helpful. But then he began completing tasks directly in my queue, things assigned to me alone, with my credentials tied to them. He'd do it during breaks or the rare times I stepped away, and when I confronted him gently, he'd give this puzzled look, as if I should be grateful. I overheard him telling another employee that we were basically together, and the casual tone he used made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't ignore. When I tried to put some distance between us, shorter replies, leaving the area more often, changing where I took breaks, he reacted by filing complaints against me. Accusations that I had cornered him, pressured him, sent inappropriate emails that investigators later showed me, messages that looked like they came from my address but weren't written by me. The situation spiraled so quickly that I barely had time to process how absurd things were becoming. Security pulled me into a small conference room one afternoon, asking why I had emailed Colin messages implying I wanted to fix things between us privately. The timestamps matched moments when I was in meetings with multiple witnesses, but there they were on the logs, sent from my account. I remember sitting there trying to explain that I hadn't written any of it, and watching the supervisor's expression twist into this uncomfortable uncertainty, like he wanted to believe me but had no idea how to handle what he was seeing. Meanwhile, Colin kept acting like everything happening was just a normal dispute between co-workers. When I walked past him, he'd tilt his head slightly, as if we shared some secret no one else understood. After HR got involved, I thought things might slow down, but he started finding new ways to insert himself into places he didn't belong. The building had storage rooms that the cameras didn't fully cover, blind corners created by old shelving and poor installation. He began showing up in those exact spots whenever I passed through them alone. He wouldn't touch me, but he'd block part of the exit with his body, speaking softly, saying things like, "We could just talk if you stopped avoiding me." The worst part was how calculated it felt. Every time I changed my routine, different routes, different break times, he'd adapt, almost like he was mapping the building in real time through my movements. I started sticking close to coworkers, walking in groups, avoiding any hallway where I couldn't see both ends. Even then, he found ways to get to me. He'd slide papers onto my desk containing strange handwritten notes about how relationships take effort, or how I made things complicated. My manager tried intervening once, but Colin just smiled awkwardly and acted confused, pretending he didn't understand why I interpreted his behavior as anything more than attempts at reconciliation. The unsettling part was how good he was at playing harmless. He knew exactly when to panic, when to act timid, when to look overwhelmed. Around others, he became this soft-spoken guy who just wanted to fix an imaginary conflict. The night everything peaked, I stayed later than planned to finish end-of-day reports. The building had that hollow quietness it gets after everyone leaves. Lights humming faintly, vents clicking. The kind of silence that makes every sound feel too sharp. I kept checking the hallway, half expecting him to appear, but my floor seemed empty. When I finally walked out to the parking lot, the air felt heavy, like a storm was building somewhere far away. My car sat alone near the back row, and even from a distance I noticed something about it looked wrong. The angle felt off, slightly slumped toward the ground in a way I couldn't ignore, but I didn't understand what was going on until I got closer. All 4 tires were sliced open, the cuts clean and deliberate, not the kind of damage you get from hitting debris. A piece of paper was tucked beneath the wiper, held in place by the breeze. I remember staring at it for a moment before picking it up, my pulse stumbling when I recognized his handwriting. The message read, "You don't get to leave until I say so." There was no signature, but it didn't need one. Every letter leaned forward in the exact same way as the notes he'd left on my desk. I backed away from the car instinctively, scanning the lot, half expecting him to step out from behind one of the pillars or from between the delivery trucks. I ran back toward the building, but the main doors had already locked for the night, leaving only the employee exit on the side. I hovered near the doorway, trying to call someone from security, but the signal in that corner of the lot always dropped to almost nothing. While I was waiting for the bar to fill enough to get a call through, I noticed movement near the fence. Just a shift of darkness, but enough to make my breath hitch. I ducked inside the stairwell and stayed there, listening for steps or voices. Nothing came. After a few minutes, one of the night shift supervisors returned from a smoke break and walked me to the security office, insisting I shouldn't go back out alone. They reviewed the cameras, but the lot angles were terrible, and the vandalism had happened just outside the visible range. When the investigators finally got involved, everything unraveled at once. They discovered he'd been accessing internal systems he shouldn't have touched, logging into schedule trackers, opening archived shift data, reviewing my time card history, even monitoring when my badge scanned through certain doors. The IT team found a pattern stretching back months, with him quietly building a profile of my routines. The worst discovery was that he had manipulated certain camera feeds during specific moments when he, coincidentally, bumped into me in those storage areas. He acted like all of this was a misunderstanding, claiming he just liked being prepared, but the digital trail was too thorough to dismiss as anything innocent. I ended up taking extended leave while the company handled the fallout. He was removed from the premises, escorted out in complete silence, not saying a word to anyone. The investigators told me he'd been planning his claim for far longer than anyone expected, but they wouldn't go into detail beyond that. I never saw him again after that night, and part of me still wonders what would have happened if his note hadn't been the thing that finally pushed everything into the open. I've changed jobs since then, changed routines, changed the way I move through spaces. Even now, whenever I walk through a quiet parking lot, I catch myself checking the corners, making sure no one is waiting in those patches of darkness just beyond the lights. Something about that night sticks with me even now, mostly because it started like any other slow weekend in our place. I'd been living with my roommate Tyler for about a year, and most weekends we were out with friends. But that night we were both wiped from work and just wanted a quiet break. The building was old but decent, the kind where sounds carried easily through the hallways, doors shutting, people laughing upstairs, the elevator clanking like it had its own personality. We'd ordered takeout, thrown on a movie, and were just talking about nothing important. Everything felt ordinary in that very specific way that makes what happened next feel even stranger. I remember the air from the open kitchen window drifting in, cooler than usual, and the way it made the blinds click together in a steady rhythm that almost lulled me into sleep. The knock came during a lull in the movie, 3 taps that didn't sound rushed or nervous, just deliberate. Tyler muted the TV and we glanced at each other because it was late enough that nobody we knew would be dropping by. Then came the voice through the door, soft, steady, almost gentle, saying, "Hey, sorry to bother you. Could I borrow a phone for a moment?" It was the kind of tone someone uses when they're trying extra hard to seem harmless. For a second, I wondered if maybe a neighbor got locked out or their battery died. But the way the voice lingered after the question, as if waiting for us to get closer to the door, set off something instinctive inside me. I didn't go near the peephole, and Tyler didn't either. We just stayed completely still, listening. The silence between the door and us stretched out longer than felt normal. Whoever stood outside didn't knock again, didn't repeat the request, just stayed there. We could hear a faint, controlled breathing from the other side, like the person was standing only inches away, paying attention to the tiniest sounds inside our apartment. I remember the way Tyler's expression shifted, not panicked, but focused, the look he got when he was trying to figure out what wasn't matching up. Neither of us said a word. We didn't whisper, didn't move, didn't even turn the movie sound back on. Eventually, footsteps moved down the hall, slow and evenly paced, not hurried like someone who genuinely needed help. The hallway went quiet again, but that quiet didn't feel like safety. It felt like a held breath. About 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with an emergency alert from the local police department. I thought it was a missing person alert at first, because that's usually what shows up. but this one mentioned a violent assault inside our own building, just 2 floors above us. The message said the suspect had entered the victim's apartment by claiming he needed to borrow a phone. I read it twice before showing it to Tyler, who stared at the screen without saying anything. There was this heavy realization settling in between us, not frantic but cold and certain. That calm voice at our door had been the same man, and if we had answered, even just cracked the door to see who it was, our night would have gone in a completely different direction. We locked every door and window even though we were already on the inside, and for a while we just sat there listening to the building. Every little creak suddenly felt sharper, like the sounds had new meaning. Somewhere upstairs we heard people talking in rushed, uneven voices, and then the distant thumping of emergency responders moving through the stairwell. Tyler kept the lights low, and I remember noticing how the glow from the TV made the living room feel strangely hollow, like the room was just waiting for something else to happen. Neither of us said anything about going to bed or turning the movie back on. It was as if doing anything normal would break whatever thin barrier had kept that man from stepping into our home. A couple of hours later, someone knocked again. This time fast, urgent, unmistakably loud. My whole chest tightened at the sound until a voice identified itself as the police. Tyler checked the peephole before opening the door just a crack, and 2 officers stood there in full uniform, clipboards in hand. One of them asked if we'd heard or seen anything unusual earlier in the night, mentioning the assault upstairs. When we told them about the soft-spoken man and his request, they exchanged a look that wasn't dramatic or exaggerated. Just a brief, knowing glance from 2 people who had already pieced together what was going on. They wrote down everything we could remember, even the tone of his voice, and the officer said something like, "You did the right thing by not answering." Over the next few days, the building felt different. Neighbors who usually nodded politely in the hallway now lingered, asking if we'd heard anything new from the police. The woman who lived across from us, usually quiet and kept to herself, started checking in on us when she saw our door open. It was like the whole floor had suddenly woken up to how vulnerable we'd all been without realizing it. Tyler kept replaying the moment in his head, describing the exact timing of the knocks, wondering if the man had watched our lights from under the door. I couldn't shake the idea that he had picked us randomly, or worse, intentionally, and was just waiting to see if we made a single wrong move. The actual confirmation came from a detective who called me a week later. He explained that the attack hadn't been spontaneous. The man had been studying the building, choosing apartments based on who seemed likely to open the door late at night. He'd been posing as a distressed neighbor to test reactions, and the assault upstairs had happened after someone believed his story long enough to unlock their door. Hearing it laid out like that made my throat tighten. It wasn't just a close call. It was a moment where one tiny decision, staying silent, had kept something terrible from crossing our threshold. I hung up the phone and just sat there, staring at the door like it had become a living thing with its own history now. For a long time after that call, evenings in the apartment didn't feel the same. I found myself paying attention to sounds I never noticed before. The elevator slowing to a stop, the soft tap of pipes cooling at night, the shuffle of someone passing our door on their way to the trash chute. It wasn't fear exactly, more like my senses had been rewired to catch details I used to overlook. Tyler started placing a small metal bar under the doorknob whenever we stayed in for the night, something he laughed about like it was overkill, though his eyes told a different story. The place that once felt relaxed and familiar now carried this quiet tension, as if the walls remembered what almost happened. One night, maybe 2 weeks after the incident, there was a single knock, just one, around dinner time. It wasn't late, but the sound still jolted both of us upright. Tyler went to the peephole immediately, and I stood behind him, barely breathing. It turned out to be a delivery driver at the wrong door, holding a stack of pizzas meant for someone down the hall. Tyler told him politely, and the guy apologized with a confused tilt of his head before walking away. Even though nothing was wrong, the moment left a strange weight in the air, like our minds were still catching up to the idea that a knock didn't automatically mean danger. But the instinct to go silent, to wait things out rather than respond, had become automatic. Eventually, our building installed new security measures, cameras in the hallways, key fobs on every floor entrance, brighter lights that hummed faintly during the night. The management sent out a long email about community safety and updated protocols, though everyone knew the real reason. People carried themselves differently in the hall now, nodding with a bit more awareness, locking their doors a little quicker. The woman 2 floors up moved out shortly after, her door staying dark and empty for weeks before new tenants arrived. Sometimes I wondered if she left because of what happened or because walking past the scene every day became too much. With time, the tension softened, turning into something more manageable, a lesson rather than a constant threat. But every once in a while, when I'm settling in for the night and the building gets quiet enough for the refrigerator hum to echo through the kitchen, I think back to that soft voice outside our door. The calmness in it, the patience, the way he waited, listening. It still unnerves me how ordinary his request sounded and how close we were to letting him in. And even though life moved on and the building feels safe again, I never forget that one simple choice, staying silent, might be the only reason I'm able to tell this story now.